Hello, everyone. Welcome to South Carolina Linux Users Groups. This is Upstate Carolina Linux Users Group in this building and Columbia Linux Users Group online. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Jace.
And tonight, December of 2023, we've got David Nally with us. He is the director at AWS, and he's going to talk about how open source is winning. Hot dog. Thank you for being here with us tonight. And it's good to see you. And I'll let you take it away, and I'll stop sharing this so that we can see you right here. There we go.
Thanks, Jace. Jace is far more optimistic than I am. I want to talk about the consequences of winning. So just real brief intro. I do live here in the upstate of South Carolina. I run several teams at Amazon focused on open source software strategy. I've done a open source startup that exited successfully back in 2010, 2011. I've run the OSPO at BlackBerry. I've worked on the OSPO at Citrix. I've worked at the Linux Foundation. Currently, I'm also the president of the Apache Software Foundation. I've been involved in open source for about 2 decades.
I'm sorry, OSPO.
Open Source Programs Office is what OSPO stands for. Typically, they're involved with defining open source strategy or dealing with legal compliance around open source software licensing. So, couple of predicate matters that I want to talk about first. First is open source has won, in my opinion. Most of the cool technology that you're seeing is made available under an open source license today. Open source licenses are pervasive, and compared to where we were 30 years ago, open source has now become de facto accepted. In the early days, and even later with more conservative industries like automotive or hardware, open source was looked at kind of suspiciously. They were breaking all of the models that people had understood for acquiring software. It used to be that if you wanted to use somebody else's software, you would go start with your finance department, make sure you had budget. Then you'd go to your procurement department and they would pull in lawyers. The other side would have lawyers. You would negotiate an agreement and terms for consuming software. And open source has upended all of that. And it used to be that open source was begrudgingly accepted. If you worked in an open source program office, and there were very few 2 decades ago, you would go and ask permission, can I use this piece of software? And the open source programs office may make that decision themselves. They may pull in an intellectual property attorney. But the thing that has in my view really accelerated the adoption of open source has been that lawyers got comfortable with the licenses and had to stopped approving them, and also the volume of requests increased massively. And so I used to work at a software company that had a product, and that product had 1,200 pieces of open source software in it. When you looked at the dependency stack and transitive dependencies for a single piece of enterprise software, there were 1,200 open source dependencies that were included in that. And so the consumption of open source software has just ballooned like crazy. And it's gotten to the point where even in the most conservative software shops, the attorneys are saying, hey, here are some pre-approved licenses. If it's MIT or BSD or the Apache license or GPL, we are familiar enough with that. We understand the repercussions of adopting that, and you no longer have to ask permission. To give you an idea, so I don't know how familiar you are with code scanning software, but software composition analysis software like Black Duck is used pervasively by large corporations. They want to understand what the software that they are purchasing or that they're consuming is made of, and they use this. It's kind of the gold standard for software composition analysis, and it's also used pervasively in mergers and acquisitions of software companies. So, regardless of whether you're an open source software company or not, if you're getting acquired, your software is all going to go through one of those scanners, and so that folks can take a look at what kind of licensing obligations you're bringing in with the software. Black Duck and the company behind it released a report this year that said that 96% of all of the code bases that they scanned, so they're doing massive reporting on every one of their users who's using their software, 96% of the code bases contained open source. I personally think that means that there's a flaw in their software, because that should at least be 99%. But let's be conservative, 96%. The other interesting fact was that of those 96% that they said contained open source software, when they looked at composition by analysis, and they were saying what percentage of the code base is open source, right? More than 75%. The average code base that they saw was more than 75% open source. You cannot get away from open source. One of the other things that has really struck home to me just how pervasive open source is. And to be clear, I've been involved in open source for 2 decades. I believe that open source is the dominant way that we build technology today. I did not know what pervasive meant until Log4Shell. And when Log4Shell happened, it disrupted the industry so much that things that were said to never happen actually happened. I was shopping in Ingalls, doing grocery shopping, and Jen Easterly, who is the director of CISA, started messaging me on LinkedIn. And I was like, oh, this is cool. And I was bragging to my wife, hey, Jen Easterly just reached out to me. I'm like, this is not a good thing, David. Similarly, a lot of my colleagues at Amazon are really impressed that I got to testify before Congress. And I'm like, that's not a good thing. When your particular area of the world has become so significant that that politicians and heads of government are interrupting what they're doing to ask you questions, you have done something wrong. And so open source is ubiquitous, and you cannot fathom every little thing that open source exists in. If you're wearing a smartwatch, if you use a television that connects to the internet or not, if you use basically anything with silicon in it today, there's open source software there. And so it is just so incredibly pervasive. That has some consequences though, right? So we are at the point where nobody looks at us anymore as dirty free software hippies. And nobody's asking anymore, hey, why are you giving all this stuff away for free? Now, they don't really understand why you're giving it away for free, but they're not asking the question anymore. It's become acceptable. And so that does bring some consequences. The first consequence is now everybody realizes that open source is everywhere. I'm sure not a lot of folks are following European regulatory frameworks right now, but the Cyber Resiliency Act in the EU essentially targeted, among other things, open source software. And when we talked to European regulators and members of parliament, we said, you don't understand. Open source is important. You don't need to regulate it. You will hurt innovation. Open source is the heart and the corridor from which a lot of innovation happens. And if you interfere with that by making it onerous to release and ship open source software, then you're going to hinder innovation. And we tried quantifying that. Look at the size of open source software, look at the impact just on the EU. And their response to us was, yes, we understand. Open source is important. It's really important. It's so important that we have to regulate it. And so I do think we're in a much nicer place right now with the CRA, which is still being finalized and is probably 5 or so years from actually having material impact. But governments are standing up and paying attention. I've been invited to the White House 3 times now because the White House is like, open source is important. And Ann Neuberger, who is the Deputy National Security advisor, she described it as open source as a witch's brew of software, and that we don't know what's in it, and that it's going to be the downfall of Western civilization. The last part she didn't say, but she did call open source a witch's brew. And there is this perspective that they don't understand why open source exists or why it's given away for free. But they have come to the realization, because they've seen the impact from security issues around open source, that they think they need to do something. And frankly, that's a little scary, because governments tend to not be the most forward thinking in terms of technology, and the mechanisms that they have for actually building, for actually improving things are pretty rare. I see 2 people have been chatting, so 2 people are trolling me already. Ben, if Zoom only has 51, I will buy you dinner.
That's what their software license page says.
So understand that they are only reporting the software that requires attribution then.
I think that's probably right.
Yeah. I mean, companies will do the minimum legally required attribution. But so the first is, everybody in the world with a regulatory outlook is looking at open source software and trying to figure out how to regulate it. They're scared of what it portends. And I'm specifically worried about a couple of things. First, techno-nationalism. I am worried that we're going to end up in a situation where there are a number of countries that are forbidden from participating in open source projects, and that open source projects are going to have to start asking, hey, where do you come from? Specifically at the Senate, the Senate asked me repeatedly about how this was being abused by Russia, and it felt like they were trying to blame the invasion of Ukraine on Log4Shell, and also whether the Chinese intelligence community had been taking advantage of Log4Shell before it was disclosed to the Apache Software Foundation, which I don't know. And I would think, frankly, folks in the federal government who have top secret clearances would probably know that far better than I. But that is the kinds of questions that are going around, is who is introducing flaws? Where did those people come from? How do people gain status in an open source project? And while I tried to assuage the fears, talking about some of the academic research that had been done on the Linux kernel, where a team tried to introduce security vulnerabilities into it, and those were roundly rejected, which is the only data that I'm aware of one way or the other on the subject. It is clear that people are starting to think about that. And people are also starting to think about, are these people qualified to write software? One of the things that in a one-on-one briefing that I had with Senate staff, they asked, how do you know the people that you're giving commit access to? When they become a maintainer or a committer on a project, what kind of vetting are you doing? Are you doing background checks on them? I'm like, well, let me tell you this story about the Linux kernel. And, at one point there was the maintainer of the 2.4 Linux kernel line. And the person who owned that was 16 years old in Brazil. And no one knew it until they tried to fly him somewhere.
Yeah.
They tried to bring him to a Linux con for a kernel contributor summit. And he asked, can my mom come with me?
Yeah.
And before that, they did not know that the person who maintained the Linux 2.4 kernel was 16 years old. So there are a lot of people who are suddenly amazed that we build trust over the internet without knowing that who people are, or what their qualifications are, in some cases, even their age is. The next thing that I'm worried about is that we're going to create a situation where there are such onerous security controls that open source is not allowed to innovate. And I think we have this idea of open source being like Log4j, which is a pervasive library and is used everywhere. But that is not the vast majority of open source. Most open source is somebody solving their own problem, and maybe 5 people in the world use it. On top of that, most of the software out there, people don't have any idea how it's being used or where it's being used. One of the things that with Log4Shell and Log4j in particular that I had to answer is, they asked me, do you know how many times people have installed your software? And I didn't. As a matter of fact, I had never looked at the download numbers for any of the material packages that the Apache Software Foundation ships. And so, yes, I can go look at the Maven Central numbers, and I can see that people are downloading Log4j 30 million times an hour. And I get a sense that maybe people like this piece of software, but I don't have any idea of actually how broadly it's used. Is that one guy who's got a really janky Jenkins setup that downloads it every second? Because the smart people are, the people who are doing this at any scale, they're running a mirror of Maven Central, so we're not seeing their downloads. And so I've got no visibility into how people are doing it. I had no idea that people were putting Log4j in phlebotomy machines in hospitals, and nobody asked permission to do that. And I don't want them to have to ask permission, but they're using it in ways that we did not imagine. And I think that's a good thing. That's one of the innovative things about open source, is you don't have to have permission. But I worry that we're going to reach a point in which it becomes the security controls are going to be one size fits all. And it doesn't matter if you're a single developer writing something in your basement, or a huge multinational company that's releasing open source software as a product. Currently, all of the regulatory frameworks that we're seeing around open source that are being proposed look at those two situations is identical. And so while Amazon, when we release something, we automatically do pen tests and we're looking at our dependency lists and things of that nature. But I don't expect the college sophomore who's writing something in a programming class to solve a problem that he's got to go do the same thing. And it does not actually make us more secure to demand that of everyone who's writing software. So those two are the first issues on the security front. Anyone want to say anything? You guys are all quiet. I mean, I know I'm right, but nobody wants to say.
We're all in
I
fault.
would echo what you're saying about the concerns around security with open source. It's just like, it feels like my job is every day, because it's like, oh, let's rewrite that as, let's roll our own. And it's just like, we don't even understand the full scope of what they've worried about. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, it's more secure. And it's kind of like, yes, but it's stupid. It's kind of like how I feel on a lot of cases. It's like, I just don't want to solve problems that have been solved. I want to do something interesting and new. And I just feel like the security pushes us in that direction.
I certainly feel that push. I will say that by the time most people work out the math on what it takes to replace even some of those components, a software company that I worked for, I talked to the CEO and I asked him, what do you think percentage-wise our products, what do you think the open source percentage of products are? And he said, certainly less than 10%. We don't have any products with more than 10%. The reality is we didn't have any products less than 80% open source. And so I think most of the time, by the time you get to the math of replacing it, you're like, yeah, no, we do not need to spend that kind of money to replace a web server and a bunch of logging frameworks. And
and also with security, you don't want to create your own security algorithms because you want to use well-vetted and well-maintained. I mean, there's the danger with that.
You do. And
security through obscurity is certainly not a good thing.
Well, it is a thing, and people certainly like it because we keep seeing calls for doing things that you don't understand.
It's like hiding in the shadows. Never mind that you're completely naked.
Yes. Yes, I have. There are similar things coming up with, what C is a really problematic language. C++ is has lots of memory safety issues. And the world is written in C, unless it's written in Java. But so much of the world, and I'm talking software that's been around for 20 or 30 years, is written in C. And there's a big push right now to talk about memory safety. And let's just rewrite everything in Rust. Rust will solve all the problems. Now let's ignore the fact that you can write unsafe Rust.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, the standard library for Rust has unsafe components. Okay, so we're ignoring that. Rust is a silver bullet. You're going to rewrite everything in Rust. It's going to be memory safe. That will theoretically shut down 70% of modern software vulnerabilities because they're memory related when you look at vulnerabilities by volume. Except then you've got to go put all of that software in all of the new places. So you're going to take Boost, right? Boost is used everywhere. You're going to take Boost out and you're going to replace it with a Rust-based variant. That it's not, right? That 20-year-old piece of hardware, the copier that uses it, you're not replacing that. That is long lived. And even if it was, right? let's say you were able to buy a copier or a phlebotomy machine or something else, and the company behind it was all into this DevSecOps, and they were doing continuous integration, and they were pushing out new builds over the air every day. You're still not doing it. It's going to cost a fortune. And there is no copier company that's doing that, by the way. So, all of this, we think of the cloud native software deployments. We think of the cloud native software deployments that are out there as being cool and very agile, and you can upgrade and change dependencies very easily. The bulk of the world does not work that way, especially when you're talking about hardware. And the embedded world dwarfs the software world. You can't imagine it. The number of systems that are in cars that will never, ever be upgraded, even if they're a connected car. Basically, as soon as they're off the line, they are written off in terms of software versions. So,
I want to ask a question.
Sure.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Interrupt, please.
So asking as a non-technical person, actual product design, what is like, I hear what you're saying about not regulating open source. What is the still man for regulating open source? If there is one, but like what, if you had to basically argue for it, what would it be and like how far would you go?
I would argue that the people making money should be regulated. You should hold them to account for the software that they're selling and the products that they're shipping to customers.
Some end use kind of?
So I'm careful about end user because the end user of a library like Log4j might be a software company, because the actual end user who's interacting with the product probably doesn't know that there are logs being kept. And this entire producer-consumer thing in open source really looks like there's producers of a bunch of libraries here. They're consumed by producers of a bunch of libraries here who are shipped, that someone downloads, who builds a software product that they sell or they provide as a service. And so you may have 5 or 10 different producers in that chain of libraries. And my thought is, what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to say, hey, if you produce screws and someone picks a screw that is not fit for purpose, it needs to be a grade 8 screw or grade 8 bolt, and they picked a pot metal decorative bolt and put it in place, we really want everybody to be a grade 8 bolt. And the world does need some grade 8 bolts, but it should be on the person who is actually shipping a product and selling it, that they should be choosing grade 8 bolts, not that every bolt manufactured should be a grade 8 bolt.
Is there a framework already to like kind of go after people you're talking about, right, who are selling it? Is there already kind of regulation for that?
There is not today. So under the Uniform Commercial Code, software is not a good. And if you go look at any of the software contracts today, including the open source licenses that are available, all warranty is disclaimed. So certainly in the US, the idea of there being liability around software and the shipper of software does not exist today. Europe is trying to change that with the CRA, and we'll see how that shakes out. That is still being debated. I think it's with the Trilog right now, and they are settling on the language that's going to be applied. And then a lot of that is then pointing to standards that do not yet exist, which means standards will have to be developed. But today, essentially, software is a free-for-all. the closest thing we get to any real regulation is medical devices and airplanes.
So when I hear a lot of the regulation stuff, and I'm not sure how much of this applies to open source specific, but or just like all of computer science. So there's been like a lot of talk recently about like, we had like the Boeing, thing. That's just a problem with software. It didn't have anything to do with hardware.
Yep.
And so there's more talk about like, if software developers as a whole need to be regulated. But like, to me, I feel like a lot of the confusion about like, oh, is this caused by open source or is this like specifically for like just software developers?
It is not. All of the problems that the world has are not open source problems. Open source does have a lot of attention right now because of just how pervasive it is, and we've had a few issues that were open source related. But SolarWinds was not an open source problem. The exchange CVEs that allowed essentially RCE on an exchange box were not open source problems. So yes, there are problems there in software in general. When I talk to friends who are civil engineers, mechanical engineers, RF engineers, they all say there was a time when we were not regulated too. And they specifically, the story that they have told me is around steam power, when steam was a big way for companies and some very wealthy individuals to have power, motive power in a facility. Everybody was building gigantic tanks and big boilers, and catastrophic accident after accident from poor welds or poor construction in general. And you would have a boiler take out a city block. And suddenly there are standards, and you have to be a boiler maker, and you have to have some qualifications, and there's a process by which you do that. And then you have to sign off on it. Are we headed there? I mean, I thought we were headed there 10 years ago. So what do I know? It would dramatically slow down the pace of innovation across software, ignoring whether it's open source or not. But the idea that someone would be liable for software that we ship and be liable for a bug, that just does not exist today.
So like, what makes you think it's like, is just politicians looking for something to grab at the top before you open source? It's just like a problem. What's special about open source? Well,
Open source is in the news. Also, open source is everywhere. And I, if you've got a SolarWinds problem, that's really bad. But SolarWinds is essentially limited to their customer base. They know who all the customers are. If you come and ask me who's using Log4j, and I'm like, I don't know, 6 or so billion people in the world. It's a much bigger problem. And as one of my friends in the EU said, anytime that anything is in the paper more than a politician, it will draw their attention and make them want to come regulate. And so, and yes, Mike, I agree. If it's a grade 8 bolt and you're advertising it as such, you should be held responsible.
But at what point are you saying, okay, I've got this great library and it does this, and so I am advertising the fact that I've got this great library that everybody ought to be using. So there is, I guess I'm wondering if there's a implied warranty behind that saying it is fit for purpose.
There is not today.
I know there isn't today.
The idea of that, but I think we will get to a point where, companies will only consume things that they can either certify themselves as being high quality, which means they would have to have expertise in testing and things of that nature, or a very small subset of open source. And, we talked about, I talked about 1,200 dependencies in a single project or product. I think the news is going to be, or the demand is going to be, curate heavily, so that you only have the dependencies that you absolutely need.
I would agree with that. And I would say that if you are taking something from somebody else and you are using it yourself and then providing that extra layer on top, that you should be held responsible, not the person underneath.
Agreed.
So just as the manufacturer of the bolt, that bolt is providing it is what he says it is. I'm an engineer. Your comment about boiler codes, for example, that wasn't done. That wasn't government regulation. That was the industry coming together and certifying it. It's an industry organization that holds or that provides the certification for boilers even to this day. So somehow or another, I think the industry has to take some responsibility in these products because they are becoming essential.
I wholeheartely agree. I think that the impetus is going to be on software companies and other companies building software to regulate themselves, because the last thing we want to do is to have government come in and try and regulate. And so I agree. You're right with the boiler code. That was the industry recognizing that if they did not solve it, that the cure was going to be worse than, or the medicine was going to be far worse than the disease they were trying to treat. And I hope that as an industry, we're able to solve that for all of software, not just open source, but I hope we take care of open source in the process. Anyone else?
I think we do kind of do some of that because the multi-eyes makes shallow bugs is kind of in effect, but not fully, everywhere.
Well, I will just, my counter to that is Heartbleed, because OpenSSL, most widely used crypto library on the planet at the time, was maintained and everybody used it. Everyone used it. Amazon used it. Google used it. Microsoft used it. I used it on my pet web server at home. Everybody used it. And at the time of Heartbleed, there was one active maintainer in Germany living in a basement, his parents' basement, on public assistance. And he had found a way to get an intern for free to help him. There were people doing new feature development, but in terms of actually maintaining the code base, 2 people in a basement on public assistance in Germany. So many eyes can make all bugs shallow, but does not always, because a lot of times, particularly if it's not something very innovative and driving a lot of interest, it is hard to get people to pay attention to the boring plumbing code that we also desperately consume. And so, yes, in theory, it does, and it should make things more secure. In practice, that has not always worked out. And so I'm leery of calling that. Yes, sir.
I'm new, just a thought on that. As opposed to, and I know this is all speculation, but as opposed to regulating and telling companies and open source developers what they can and can't do, if things like OpenSSL are so critical to society and infrastructure, would it not maybe make sense for Congress to focus on providing some, tax incentives or, public goods funding for open source, just to say, hey, we're going to allocate, $100 million or something to spread across, the most critical projects of, holding up our society.
So industry is certainly trying to do that. When Heartbleed came out, the Critical Infrastructure Initiative started and doled out some money. Before Log4Shell, an initiative called the Open Source Software Security Foundation was started, and has some pretty deep pockets from various members who are funding that. And one of their projects has the theme of turning dollars into security to essentially fund that work. There was an executive order this year that directed CISA to figure out how to fund security, and so there are lots of people trying to figure out how to throw money at the problem. My concern is that security is not we go fix it one time and walk away. And so any funding that comes in has to be sustained, and that work has to be sustained. And, we're quickly looking at, $20 million being consumed in a couple of years. And does that work continue? Because people like doing something cool and awesome up front, but maintaining something and maintaining security over a period of time is really hard, boring work. And the question is, do we have the internal resilience to continue funding it over time? I don't know how that's going to work out. CISA is very early. They just hired their open source software supply chain security lead in September or October. And she's a really smart person, but she is just getting started. And 5 years from now, maybe we'll start seeing a lot of funds flowing out.
You got a couple questions.
Okay. Yes, I am talking about sustainability. First, I use sustainability a lot. What I really mean, though, is resiliency. And that's something that that one of my colleagues has beat into my head, that, we don't need, how much active development do we actually expect to happen on a logging framework? What we really need is we need to know that when a problem happens, that someone is there, knows the code base well enough, and can go fix it. Not that they sling 1,000 lines of code every week and are adding new features, because that's not doing anything for improving a logging framework that's been around for 20 years. And yes, there is a lot of open source in the U.S. federal government, and especially DoD. One of the interesting things to me has been to see how the NSA has become one of the larger contributors to open source software, contributing things like Niagara files to the Apache Software Foundation to improve security on Apache Cassandra. They really liked Cassandra as a database, but when they had mixed classification levels, they could not trust it. So they essentially added what is row level security to Apache Cassandra. And almost all funded out of the NSA originally. I got a couple more things. And actually, how am I doing on time? All right, so we're almost at an hour in. The next problem is, because open source has won, and because open source has become so pervasive, that it has acquired a halo. And people think of it as being a moral good. In fact, a lot of people want to work on open source because it's a cool thing and they enjoy it. It is just this thing that gives them warm fuzzies. And I'm one of those folks, right? It gives me warm fuzzies to work on cool software that's given away for free. And that has a couple of things. First of all, when the term open source was first coming about, and even prior to that, when the term was free software or Libre software, we were primarily thinking in terms of copyright licenses. If you go look at the open source definition today on the OSI's website, or you go look at Stallman's Four Freedoms, all of the elements are really about what you have rights to do with under a copyright license. The Four Freedoms in particular actually call out rights that apply under copyright, right? Right to use, the right to redistribute, the right to modify, the right to distribute your modifications. Those are all essentially rights that are available and that can be provided to you under the Copyright Act. And so most of our adjudication about what open source is comes down to a copyright license. In fact, most of the open source licenses out there don't even include patent grants. And so we were very narrowly trying to solve a problem of how can I share my work to help other people? And we thought that the biggest villain was the Copyright Act. And the all rights reserved, this software is copyright Hewlett-Packard, and you cannot improve a printer driver because Hewlett-Packard controls it and they're not going to let you. And so today, when we talk about open source, the motivations for releasing something under an open source license vary wildly, right? I talked about the fact that a lot of IP lawyers have basically gone in and said, hey, if it's under the MIT license, you can use it anywhere in the company. We don't care. Don't come and ask permission. You're wasting our time. And so when we think about open source, when I say open source, I automatically think of curl. I think of Jackson. I think of these really community-driven, grassroots open source projects where people are building things to solve problems for people. But the reality is that a lot of software that is open source is not developed in the open. It doesn't have open governance. It doesn't have a welcoming community where you can go get involved. To pick on Amazon a little bit here, the AWS SDK, we released that under an open source license because we want it easy for our customers to consume. We have no desire to accept pull requests for that, right? We have no desire to set up a project management committee or a technical steering committee of open source contributors to tell us how to do that better. We're giving that software away and we want it to be very easily consumed. But if you go look, show me the open source projects at AWS, the SDKs come up. And frankly, that's stupid. We release those under an open source license. We want them to be easily consumable. We're not interested in building a community around the SDKs. We're not interested in a bunch of other people contributing. Frankly, it is our responsibility to go build that software. And we would rather folks invest their time in solving other problems.
Well, it seems like the reason to release the SDKs is to drive product.
The reason to release the SDK is to make it easier for people to spend their money with us.
Exactly.
I mean, just being very selfish.
Yeah.
So we've gotten into a situation where open source has this element of, I hate saying moral superiority, but it is in the marketplace seen as almost philanthropic when you open source something. And that is not the reality today. And the fact that folks will say something is open source and automatically attach a positive sentiment to a product because it's open source has led to a number of folks wanting to build a business around open source. And some of those are very well intentioned. Some of them are great products. Some of them are not going to be open source for very long. And what we've seen is that people think that open sourcing software is a business model, and it most certainly is not. And it's creating problems in the long term because those businesses end up not being viable. They have not figured out how to make money, even when they have a great product. And I've been seeing a pattern of especially venture capital funded companies releasing their software as open source, not having a strategy, running out of runway, and changing their license to something else, especially after they get a bunch of users, free users, I might add, who are not paying them. And so that bait and switch is very much a thing. And we're seeing the creation of licenses that are very open source like. SSPL and the BSL are a couple of examples where they have some field of use restrictions, but otherwise look very similar to open source licenses. They also typically have prohibitions on redistribution. So you can't you can't make changes and then redistribute them. And so the culmination of people automatically think something positive. I'm not specifically talking about Hashi. So there's a comment here that I'm throwing shade on Hashi. I spent a lot of time talking to Armand, who's one of the co-founders of Hashi, and about this license change. And I firmly believe that it is their decision to make, right? The overwhelming majority of that software was written by HashiCorp. And while I personally disagree with their decision to do that, it is their intellectual property. The thing that I have an issue with is I think that it hurts the users of that software. Suddenly it is no longer one of those pre-approved licenses. Now you have to go ask permission from a lawyer to use it. And particularly because BSL has variability in how the license can be applied in the terms. There's actually a section that you can modify the terms. It means that every time BSL is applied to a product, it will need approval from an IP attorney at any company of any size. So, there's some huge overhead that comes from these license switches. I also think, though, this is not really a new problem. The scale of it is new. But in the old days, we had people releasing software under GPL licenses. And the GPL applied to everyone but them because every contributor had to sign a contributor licensing agreement that granted copyright to the company. And so that has fallen out of favor because people like permissive licenses a little more, and permissive licenses don't have that problem. Generally speaking, unless that contributor licensing agreement is coming from a nonprofit foundation whose charter requires them to release software to the public free of charge, I would look at CLAs with some suspicion. And I think that they are an anti-pattern in good open source. But the fact that open source has become so popular means everybody wants to be open source. They want to be the popular kid. First time in my life, that everybody wants to be like me, right? I'm apparently doing something cool now, and so people want to emulate me, which has never been true before in my life. But you know, so we see a lot of folks calling things open source, and I talked about this in
Or even have an open in their name.
yes. First of all, open anything is better than nothing, but open source is the best. And so there's a lot of open washing happening in the industry, and that's not a new problem, but the volume of it is a huge new problem. And so I mentioned in the talk description that you've got to talk about artificial intelligence to get a talk. That has been true everywhere I've talked this year. Everybody wants to talk about generative AI. So this is my spiel to actually get a talk accepted. Generative AI is, well, AI in general is not new. Has its basis in machine learning. The overwhelming majority of machine learning tools are open source. PyTorch, TensorFlow, etc. So long history of open source being involved in machine learning and neural language processing and all of the things that build us to the stage where we have some semblance of artificial intelligence. But when we talk about AI systems, it's not clear that an open source license might even be able to be applied. So typically in these systems, you've got transformers that are taking data in. We'll talk about the data in a minute. That is software. That can have an open source license. That really is applying a bunch of math, right? And so we end up with these weights and that constitute our model. But that's all math and numbers. And not a lawyer, spend lots of time with lawyers. I'm not sure that the math, the resultant math and the resultant body of numbers is something that can be copyrighted. So we have our transformer. That's mostly software. Copyright license can apply to that. We have our weights. Probably not copyrightable. We have output, where some countries have already said that outputs from AI systems are not copyrightable. And that is the current vague position held by the Copyright Office, although they've got an RFC out now to see whether that should actually be their holding. And then all of that came from a bunch of data, right? So do folks know what the Common Crawl data set is? You know what Common Crawl is?
No.
Okay, so Common Crawl is basically someone put a web crawler out and crawled a bunch of web pages and then assembled all of that data together in this massive chunk. And Common Crawl is a pretty consistent element in most of the large language models right now. So people are taking all of this data on the web, acting like they read it. I mean that's what we're saying. We didn't infringe copyright by taking a copy of this. This is merely how a computer reads, and it's just like me going up to your website and reading an article on your website. I am learning from it. So we have a lot of questions around what the copyright license is for all of the data that we pulled into it. But we know that it's not an open source license in the majority of cases, right? And so we've got all this data that we shoved into a transformer, and on the other side we got a bunch of weights, and then we're applying that. What part of that's open source? Yet the majority of the models that are out there today describe themselves as open source models. And we don't really know what open source is, right? When I talked to earlier, we talked about open source as in the early days, it was essentially built around copyright. We've got a situation where copyright maybe doesn't apply, maybe does apply to half the thing. And we're not sure what open source AI is. There's a group of folks who are working on trying to define what open source AI might be, in part because so many people are saying we're open source AI. I don't know what open source AI is going to mean. Does that mean the transformer's open, the data is open? Probably not, because there's relatively limited data sets that have a license that we would describe as open source. And by the way, most of the open source licenses are really built around software, whereas these data sets, we may not want someone to modify them. Do you really want to change? Do you really want to have someone to be able to change the melting point of aluminum in a data set? An open source license, as we know it today, would require that ability. That may be the wrong answer when we're talking about needing fidelity in data, and someone saying, well, hey, I took this data set from NIST. I just happened to tweak it for my purposes, which is permissible under an open sourse license. So
I didn't like the answer it gave me, so I made it give me the answer.
exactly. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I work in AI and generative AI. Have been for years. A couple of thoughts. I'm curious what you think about them. My general mental model for this is that the data that is obviously used to train the models comes from all over and is subject to copyright. Whether it's fair use or not,
Yep.
That's a debatable question. But the transformer code to train and to use, that obviously is software, can be open source.
Sure.
The models themselves, like you said, questionable whether they could be copyrighted. I would argue that you can open source something that is not copyrightable, and the process of doing that is just saying, if this is copyrightable, I give you the right. Otherwise, you're free to use it anyway.
Sure.
But I would also argue that the output of those models can also be subject to copyright. I.e., if you are like, I think of it like we're training a brain. Like you wouldn't say you read a piece of text and therefore your brain is subject to copyright, or you read a piece of text, therefore your brain is violating a patent. I think of these models as essentially building a brain. But you would say, hey, you looked at a picture of the Mona Lisa yesterday, and then you painted something today based upon your recollection of it, and it looks very similar, and that would be subject to copyright. So I think on both sides, both on the training front, again, fair use questions, but on the output side, I would argue that that obviously the transformer code could be open source. The model weights could be open source, whether it's subject to copyright or not, I don't know. But the output to the end user, depending upon what they've requested out of it, could be subject, not necessarily to copyright. I think it should be, but that's a question of whether it can be copyrightable or not if it's purely from an AI. But the output can, even if it's not subject to allow copyright, it can violate copyright.
So I'm going to try and summarize what you just said.
Sure.
So it started with data. It obviously has copyright, probably is an open source. Questions around whether consumption of that data for training is fair use or not. I think I mostly agree. The transformer, obviously software, could be open source. The weights, the model, which to my mind we did a bunch of math and software, and math is explicitly not copyrightable. So for me, that falls apart there. I don't think model and weights
The weights
can be
are essentially lossy compression.
right.
So if it was lossless compression, you would say, oh, that's a representation of the original and it is copyrightable. Because
Yes.
it's lossy compression, I think it's super debatable. But
And then you said that you think the output, right? So I go tell Dolly to generate a photo of a monkey smoking in a bar. That the output of that you think is copyrightable?
I think the output could be subject to copyright. I think the output could violate copyright.
So
Okay.
the analogy is music. I listen to some music. The sample set, right, is copyrighted. The can't just recreate, redistribute that music. But I can transform it using my own and then create a work that, if it's too similar to previous works, can get me sued.
Correct.
If it's, and this has happened, obviously, but if it's different enough and that's really vague and not actually it gets figured out every legal battle, but you could end up with something that's truly transformed while maintaining aspects of the original.
I would argue that with many of these models, you could get a one-to-one output that is exactly like the original. Maybe it's off by a pixel or two, but it basically is the original because of how good the compression is in for things that are as well trained on. So I'm not even arguing is it transformative enough or not. I'm arguing you can get the actual Mona Lisa potentially out of one of these models, even though the Mona Lisa isn't really stored in there. It's all the math in between. I'm just saying that to me, the model itself, the weights and everything aren't copyrightable, probably aren't subject to copyright. If they are, it can be licensed, but that the person using that model can generate something with it that violates copyright.
So you're saying basically you could leverage Gen AI to wash the copyright off?
I'm saying that the law wouldn't let you do that.
Yeah.
So Japan has said anything generated by AI can't be copyrightable.
Yes.
The U.S. has rejected a number of copyright registrations that were created by AI and said human was not involved in the creation of this thing, can't possibly be copyrighted because human must be involved. There are a lot of folks, especially IP folks, who are worried about the problem of creating so accurate of a replica, right? And particularly in software. So Amazon has a generative AI tool called Code Whisperer, which is supposed to be a coding application. And one of the steps that it takes is to basically go back and look at everything it was trained on to say, does this match anything? And if there's a certain fidelity percentage over that, we say, you know what, this looks a lot like this, and you may want to reference this. And ideally under an open source license, and so create a reference, because we're worried. We do not want our customers to have to worry about something that one of our generative AI tools creating liability for them. I do think I do think the output question is unsettled, and I am reminded of the early days of photographs as to whether photographs could be copyrighted or not. And the prevailing attitude at the time originally was, what do you mean? You push a button and the camera takes the picture, or you expose some film, but the camera is taking the picture. There's no human involvement in that. Ignoring that a human was responsible for composing the picture, getting things lined up, deciding where to take the photo from, and things like that. And so over time, the Copyright Office's opinion changed, but it was the change was that they acknowledged all of the inputs that went into creating something creative in a photograph. And what I often hear a lot of lawyers talk about is the difference between a security camera that is taking photos all the time, all day, every day in the same position, and a photographer going and taking a portrait or a landscape photo. And so one of the things that I'm hearing from a lot of the open source lawyers is that they are advising folks that it is fine to have AI assist the creation of software, but perhaps you want to go and review it, and you may want to augment what's there so that there is additional human involvement so that copyright can be claimed on the thing, and it is AI assisted, not AI generated. Now, what that's going to shake out to be, I don't know. I still think this is a separate problem, right? This is the entire world is going to start using Copilot or Code Whisperer or Cody or any of the other half dozen code generating tools around open source. And the reality is they're already using them. They're just not telling you. And we're trying to figure out sane IP policies for this cool new thing that's going to take a 1x developer and make them a 10x developer, and it's going to take a 10x developer and make them a 1000x. And we're woefully unprepared for that because we like to think that humans do everything. That's how all of our IP models work anyway. Any other questions? I'm happy to move on to the next thing.
I've got one idea
Yeah.
related to kind of what you're talking about of like no one wants to like read over these old like important libraries and like not do much. It's like I wonder if there could be like a bounty system, like it's like a lotto ticket to read all of like how this old library works. And like if junk ever hits the fan, like you get $1 million payday because you helped fix it. You're the only one who can. Which already may be just how it works, right? Because if you happen to be there, people are willing to pay to have it fixed all of a sudden. But just your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
So 0 days on the black market.
I mean that is a very lucrative practice. So there are certainly bounty systems. HackerOne runs one for a number of entities. There's been talk of other government ones. The issue is if you are relying on a bounty, you either have to be actively finding problems, and you can't go build up the expertise and then sit around and wait for bad things to happen because you still have to put food on the table. So I don't think that's a very resilient position to take. It's an opportunistic one. But I don't want the expert in OpenSSL to be living in a basement on public assistance when just waiting for the next security vulnerability to come along. I'd rather he be well employed and compensated and spending the appropriate amount of time ensuring that it is well maintained. And I certainly hope that's what we've done with OpenSSL. Yes, sir.
So if the bounty system exists, right, would the Cobra effect take place because people would try to like create
a problem and then solve it.
Yeah, and then solve it themselves?
I think that's already happening. There are a number of folks who are claiming CVEs against open source projects today that are often configuration issues. I don't have them at hand, but if you go look at Daniel Stenberg's Twitter account, he went on a rant about this where someone came to him, reported what they believed to be a security vulnerability. He said, no, this is documented. This is expected behavior, not a security vulnerability. That security researcher, and I use the term in air quotes very lightly, that security researcher went to MITRE and said, hey, there is no CNA for curl. And CNA stands for CVE Numbering Authority. I would like for you to issue a CVE for this. MITRE issues a 9.8 CVSS score CVE for something that was a configuration option and working as intended. And that's not an isolated incident. They did the same thing to PostgreSQL, where PostgreSQL rejected the vulnerability report. The person went to MITRE and said, hey, this person is not a CVNA. I think you need to I think you need to issue a CVE for this. MITRE issues one. MITRE scores it at 9.8. It is not a vulnerability. And so there are actively people who I think are doing more harm than good today by reporting non-security issues that are getting CVEs, which are setting off software scanners, which means the PCERT, the security incident response team, then has to go and figure out how to patch it. And the project says, nope, not a problem. Ignore that. And they're saying, but I've got a CVE and I've got to address the CVE. Don't you understand there's a CVE? And the project says, sorry, the CVE is stupid. And so it creates this loop because the security incident response team is like, but I've got to patch this because I'm FedRAMP certified, or I've got all of these other commitments that say I have 30 days to patch a vulnerability this severe. And so we end up in this weird loop where the people with the software are demanding a fix, and the people writing the software are saying not vulnerable. And there are people with their hair on fire saying, but there's a CVE. It is a huge problem that is actively causing issues. There's another one. I'm trying to think of what the library was. Was it GZIP? I don't remember what it was now. Where an open source project has a contrib folder in their source tree. The contrib folder is typically example code. It is not part of the core product. It is never shipped in binary form. And someone reported a vulnerability in one of the projects in that contrib folder. Again, the project was not a CVNA. The project said, yeah, that's stupid. We're just going to delete that folder, and deleted the source code. But they said, it's not a real problem, right? No one actually consumes that. It's not in the built binary. It was intended to show examples of how you could do things. And so security researcher says, I disagree, goes to MITRE, says, hey, these folks are not a CNA. I think you need to issue a CVE. They get a 9.8 CVSS score on their CVE. Security researchers like, man, I'm awesome. I've got, look at the vulnerabilities I found. This one's a 9.8 CVSS score and is in this very ubiquitously used compression library. And oh yeah, the software creep is not going to fix it. They're like, this is not an issue. We're not kicking a new release off of this. It takes a lot of work to release software. Why would we release software when this does not impact any user? And so Twitter fight emerges. On GitHub, lots of security responders are jumping on, filing an issue and saying, don't know if you know this, there's a CVE for your software. And, at this point, the maintainers of the software have a copy paste response that says, hey, yes, there was some vulnerability. It was in example code that was not actually part of the product. This is not a vulnerability. It does not warrant a 9.8 CVSS score. We're not going to release it. They're like, but the scanners are going off and they're saying there's something wrong with my software. And the most flagrant of these is container scanners, right? Container scanners are looking at version numbers in the packages in the container. And klaxons are going off and they're like, hey, you've got real problems. You need to go patch this software. Ignoring the fact that there is a CVE does not mean that there is a vulnerability in a given application that you are using in a specific way, right? So going back to Log4Shell, if you did not have Gendy in your environment, you were not vulnerable to Log4Shell. So all of the mobile phones who are using a really weird JDK, no problem for them. They could use the vulnerable version of Log4j all day with zero consequences. They did not have Jindy in the environment, which was necessary to exploit. Similarly, Heartbleed, you had to call one of 16 different code paths to be vulnerable. Now, the problem is they were very common code paths, but you could use the Heartbleed version of OpenSSL in a way that was not vulnerable. And we don't have a good way of describing that. The closest thing we have today is the VEX standard, which basically allows you to say, hey, your scanner's going to go off, but we're not exploitable. But that requires somebody to have already built an SBOM and VEX for your particular application, and for whatever scanner you're using to honor it, which does not happen in reality. Oh, I've got questions. What regulatory thoughts have been floated around open source generated AI? It has happened too fast for anyone to ask those questions. I am sure after the election, someone will get right on that. There is a lot of AI regulation going on. Europe just passed an AI Act, and there has been AI has now been regulated in the United States at the Department of Commerce level. So we are treating it as a munition, much like we did with cryptography back in the 80s or 90s. And so if you've got AI that's too good, you essentially have to limit export or access to it to non-foreign nationals. Whether that's a good idea or it's going to be to have any efficacy, I leave to the reader to determine. All right. I think I'm done with all of the consequences from winning. I'm happy to talk more. I mean, I can talk about open source for weeks. But if you have questions, I'm happy to entertain them, and I'm happy to shut up too if you're tired of listening to me. Yes, ma'am.
So I noticed during the most of the presentation, you're pretty free with interchanging open source and free software. And so what are your opinions on like Stallman's definition of free software versus open source?
I think for 99% of applications, the terms can be used interchangeably. I think there is a few niche use cases where there is a discernible difference. And so I think much like GNU Linux, the world does not care, and there is no difference between Libre software and open source.
Oh, what do you mean by Libre?
So I'm specifically using that because free is an overloaded term in English. Free can mean gratis. Free can mean, a number of other things, and it has.
I want to use like the GNU Foundations.
Sure.
Free.
Yeah. So I think, and Stallman was the reason he called it free Libre open source software was to distinguish between free as in beer from free as in speech. And so I think for the overwhelming majority of people, they cannot tell you the difference between the two. And in 99% of practical applications, there is zero difference, assuming software that you're referring to actually adheres to the open source definition. I personally like the Four Freedoms definition, and the open source definition actually came from the Debian Free Software Guidelines, and was an outgrowth of that. But it's like a 10-point or 12-point definition, I can't keep those straight in my head. But the 4 freedoms I can keep in my head, right? And so in terms of practical difference, there's almost zero. And and I think that is it's pedantic in most of the conversations.
By free, you mean like copyleft, right? Because like copyleft is very different than just open source, right?
Copyleft is different than open source, but copyleft is not necessary to meet the free software definition. So, like, if you look at the 4 freedoms, the Apache license would meet the 4 freedoms definition, but it is certainly not copyleft, right? It does not require users to share their changes, which is what copyleft requires. All right, I've got one more comment, and then I will shut up because there was a question. There are more words needed about AI as munitions and the recent regulations about that. So I don't know if you recall. Let me describe the situation in the 80s and 90s around cryptography, and that will make a lot more sense. So U.S. federal government said, we are worried about nation states using strong encryption to keep things from us. And we believe that we need to treat that as munitions. And so for a long while, under the International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, I think that's what ITAR stands for, you could not use encryption stronger than 40 bits internationally. So if you were a software company and sold outside the United States, you had to sell a 40-bit encryption protocol as standard. And if you sold the same thing internally, you would do 128 or maybe 256 bits. So we essentially treated cryptography the same as we would a tank or a grenade launcher. And you had to, if you were even in the business of producing cryptography, you had to register with the Department of State under ITAR, and they would make sure that you were complying with that, and there was an entire regulatory framework around that. Of course, this meant that all of the cryptography development moved outside of the United States, mainly to Europe. And we had things like the guy, I can't remember his name, who did PGP, who basically printed the source code for PGP so that it would be treated as free speech, because otherwise he could not share, strong cryptography across the world. Lots of lawsuits. That has become less onerous. So now we think of tanks and missiles and things like that as things that need to be regulated under ITAR at the Department of State. But there is a lesser grade of things, including things that can be used to build munitions that are that are regulated under the Department of Commerce under EAR, and I don't remember what EAR stands for anymore. There was recently an executive order that directed the Department of Commerce to place artificial intelligence systems of a certain magnitude. And frankly, they set the magnitude as nothing that is available today. So it's forward looking, and it is all about capacity. So think access to voluminous amounts of GPUs, really, are systems developed with voluminous amounts of GPUs. Much like we already deny certain states access to chips. Yes, export administration regulations. Thank you. And yes, it was Phil Zimmerman who wrote PGP and who ended up publishing a book of the source code to PGP so that he could share it broadly. I frankly thought we had learned our lesson with cryptography, but apparently not. And so something that is easily, well, GPUs are not easily shared, but systems built in software that can be stored as a vector database are easily shared over fast internet links now. So we will see about the efficacy of that.
Yeah, I was listening to like Chamath Palihapitiya and the people on there's a tech podcast I listen to All In, and they're basically it's like, well, hey, Sam Altman, all these other kind of like people are at the edge of large language models. I don't know if Amazon is part of that meeting as well, are basically going to Congress for regulatory capture to say like, hey, we've made it. Now we kind of want to keep competition down. They're helping craft the language of the executive order, maybe eventually the actual guidelines.
I
That's
don't
kind of
know.
the view of it.
I don't know in this particular instance what involvement, but as a trend, that is typically what happens, right? The experts in the field are the people already in business. And so, yeah. All right, I'm going to shut up.
I
Then.
think I'm going to cut you off. not because it's not great, but
Okay, well then now I want to talk longer. I will say, so Paul Vixie, who developed VixieCron and is kind of responsible for modern DNS, he and I were having a conversation in Dublin a year ago, and he said, people have taken open source and take it for granted, and you can't do that. You have to take when you're building something, you have to take responsibility for everything you're putting into it. And if you can't manage and be paying attention to the software that you're putting in, then you don't have any business building it because you don't have capacity to actually support it. I would encourage you to have that as a takeaway for sustainably building with open source so that we don't end up in a situation where people say, why did you use this sophomore's typo squatted Python library to do addition? Ignore the fact that addition's in the standard library. I'm not picking on Node at all. Node and their massive dependency sets are a wonderful thing, I assure you. I love them. But no, seriously, taking a dependency is a serious act, and you need to have both faith that the dependency is well built and that you can support it and that it will be well supported. And now I will shut up.
Okay. Thank you, David. We appreciate it. I'm just gonna.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for coming tonight. Thanks for everyone. We'll see you soon. Take care. And Ben, if you'll cut us off.